Good afternoon, students, and welcome to week number 5 of this course. We are almost at the end. This is a 6-week course, so this means that next week, week 6, will be our last week together. The purpose of this lecture is to go over the written portion of your midterm exam, which was an essay question that you had to answer. This question was worth 25 points, and it was worth 25 points because you were instructed to use the CIRAC method, CIRAC. So for each element, the conclusion, issue statement, rule of law, analysis, and the restated conclusion, each one was worth 5 points for a maximum total of 25 points. If you did not use the CIRAC method, you did lose points because you were asked specifically to use the CIRAC method. Um, with that being said, let us proceed with the actual problem. Now, this problem came from chapter 4 of your readings, from your textbook. And the problem is as follows. Every week, Michael played in a game of intramural football with his college friends as his team's quarterback. One afternoon, while playing in the intramural championship game, a particularly aggressive linebacker named Ray picked Michael off the ground and threw him violently onto the turf. As a result of the encounter, Michael fumbled the ball and he suffered a severe concussion. The referee flagged Ray with a penalty for his conduct. The police are also considering charging Ray with battery. You are Ray's lawyer. In response to the potential charges, Ray has simply stated, "That's football." Is Ray entitled to any defenses? Why or why not? Now, the first thing I want you guys to understand is in this class and in any other class, you should focus specifically on the call of the question. This question is asking you about defenses, okay? That means we are not concerned with whether or not the elements for battery have been satisfied. We're not concerned with the actus reus and the mens rea and the concurrence because it has already been established that this guy is being considered, the police are considering charging him with a battery. So, for all intents and purposes, the battery has already been satisfied. He committed a battery. What we want to know is, although he committed this battery, are there any defenses to which he is entitled that will absolve him of criminal liability for committing this battery? That is what the question is asking. Many of you went off on a tangent and you started talking about actus reus, mens rea, concurrence, and whether or not Ray actually committed a battery. You did not lose points if you did that. However, that analysis did not help you because that had nothing to do with the question that was being asked. Okay? Now, this question, like I said, comes from chapter 4, and chapter 4 covers justification defenses. Now, directly from your reading, you learn that with justification defenses, the defendant accepts responsibility for the act he or she is charged with, but argues that the act was permissible under the circumstances. So, more formally, conduct that is criminal, but which under the circumstances is socially acceptable and which deserves neither criminal liability nor even censure, qualifies for a justification defense. Now, of the justification defenses are necessity and consent. And based on the information in your readings, you should have learned that necessity does not apply. The justification defense of necessity does not apply in this instance. So, by process of elimination, you know that we are going to be discussing the justification defense of consent. That is, yes, I committed a battery based on the elements for a battery and the acts that I performed. I can be charged with battery. However, I am entitled to a defense, and that defense is consent. That is pretty much what Ray is saying. And your job was to determine whether or not Ray was in fact entitled to this defense of consent. So let's start with the first element of the CIRAC method, which would be the conclusion. You were expected to begin your analysis with a conclusion, and the conclusion, as you've learned from the past, just pretty much stems off of the question that you're being asked. So here, the question is asking you, is Ray entitled to any defenses? The correct answer would be no. Ray is not entitled to any defenses. You could have taken it a step further and said the defenses to which are applicable in this instance are the justification defenses. Of those justification defenses, only one applies, and that is the defense of consent. But the bottom line is the question is asking you, is he entitled to any defenses? The answer is no. That is your conclusion. Okay. Now, the issue statement, many of you appear to be confused with this issue statement, and I just want to be clear. When addressing your issue statement, your issue statement should consist of the issue that you're going to be analyzing in your analysis, okay? The issue is not that Ray picked Michael up off the ground and threw him violently on the turf. And I'm pointing this out because many of you listed that as your issue. Many of you in your assignments indicated that the issue is that Ray slammed Michael onto the turf and Michael suffered a concussion. That is not the issue. The issue is whether Ray exceeded the scope of his consent. We know that this question deals with the consent defense. Our analysis is going to cover whether or not Ray was entitled to this defense. We're going to use the facts that were given and the rule of law, which you will get from your text, and we're going to decide whether or not Ray is entitled to this defense. So if that is what our analysis is going to cover, then the issue has to be tied into that. So the issue is not going to be that he threw Michael onto the ground and Michael suffered a concussion. We know that he did that because that's already in the facts. The issue is, did he exceed the scope of his consent so much so that he has now been prohibited from asserting consent as an affirmative defense? That is our issue here. So I just want to be clear that everything has to tie in. Your conclusion is that he's not entitled to a defense. Okay? The issue is whether or not he exceeded the scope of that consent, because that's what we're going to be discussing. Okay? So once you have the issue statement down, the next thing we're going to do is address the rule of law. Now, The rule of law in this instance is not clearly stated, or it's not explicitly stated rather, in your textbook, but that doesn't mean that you can't think outside the box and use your common sense to uh, articulate what the rule of law would be in this situation, especially since there is information in your textbook that pertains to consent at sporting events. So the rule of law in this instance could have been something along the lines of generally at sporting events, specifically in the game of football, physical contact is permitted. Athletes impliedly or contractually or expressly consent to physical contact from their teammates or from opposing players. They consent to this when they sign up to play the game. However, if the scope of that consent is exceeded, then the consent can no longer serve as a defense, and the offender can then be criminally charged with battery. While this is not explicitly stated in your textbook, this concept is not foreign to you. And I know this because some of you addressed exceeding the scope of the consent in your analysis and in the rule section of your CIRAC method. So I know that this is not a foreign concept to you. So you should have been able to deduce that in your assignment.